Okay, this week begins our discussion on Come Follow Me for Doctrine and Covenants sections 71 through 75. And we are going to be talking about the idea of stewardship. So, where this idea gets brought up is in section 3 of verse 3 of section 72. And this idea has been brought up other times as well. But the Lord speaks to the church, to the elders, a group of elders, and he says, "And verily in this thing ye have done wisely, for it is required of the Lord at the hand of every steward to render an account of his stewardship, both in time and eternity. For he who is faithful and wise in time is accounted worthy to inherit the mansions prepared for him of my Father." So this section itself is referring to a particular organization called the United Order. And the Lord is directing certain elders in the promises that they will receive from being part of this order. Now, before we get into this idea of steward or stewardship, it's important to point out a few things because I first want to look at Doctrine and Covenants and explore this idea, how it's used there, and then take that to expand to a general, more overarching principle. So here we see that everyone has, well, this one's referring to the United Order, but this also, and I will make the argument later on, that this applies to everyone, that we are accountable to the Lord for our stewardship, and that our exaltation is based on how we manage and operate our stewardship. So let's then define our terms. So a steward is someone who is employed to manage domestic concerns, other servants, collect rents, basically to act as a manager of a household. And this is, in more secular terms, someone who's employed in great families. So wealthy families would hire a steward to basically act as their agent to oversee the affairs of the state, not necessarily the financial or like legal aspect, but more of like managing a household. And so what it also refers to then is when we're talking about stewards, when the Lord's talking here, I mean, you could say that there's a great house, which is his house, and we're managing that. And that's certainly one way to look at it. But the more important point is that when he's referring to steward, he's referring to us as being managers of some area or domain that is within our control. And so that's our stewardship. It refers to an area that is within our control that we manage. So in the Doctrine and Covenants, we learn of two, I call them economic systems, and two orders, you could call them as well, which is the law of consecration and the United Order. And these are not one and the same, although we often use the term United Order interchangeably with the law of consecration. But the law of consecration was a system that applied to the members church-wide, and they would deed their property to the bishop, and then they would receive a portion back, and then they were responsible for managing that portion of the property they received, and then what surplus they received would be given back to the bishop to then be allocated among the members to provide for those who need it. And each individual had equal claim in the sense that they could get a portion back, but the degree of stewardship or the amount or the type or the extent varied from family to family and based on the needs of the person. And so that's the law of consecration. And then in these sections here, and we started actually in section 70, but um, in the section 71 through 75, we are now learning about this United Order, United Firm, which was a mercantile literary establishment. And the members of this establishment were basically creating a joint business venture. So they'd come together to have a common goal or vision, and they would combine their assets or consecrate their assets to the organization as a whole, and then they would receive a portion back. And this United Firm owned the property. So you gave it all to the firm, but then as a result of being a member of the firm, you were then given a portion back to then manage. And the purpose of this was to ensure that the publishing of the Book of Mormon and other literature was able to happen, such as the inspired version of the Bible as well, and any other things that were being published. The idea was that money would then go for that and any other business enterprise. And the idea was to help the poor. And the feature was the profits were pooled, and then it would be divided. Well, first the profits were pooled and then allocated to where money needed to be, but then also those who were members of the firm could draw from that by going to the treasury to receive a portion of what they needed. And that was also their stewardship. And that's what the Lord is referring to in this verse, as he's talking about their portion they receive. He's saying you are going to be held accountable for how you manage that. And if you manage it well, then you are counted worthy and can inherit the mansions in heaven. So that's an overview of stewardship in Doctrine and Covenants. But now let's broaden this out to a bigger concept. And to do that, I want to talk about the parable of the 10 talents. And so in that parable, we learn of a man who has gone away. He has 3 servants, and he gives each of the servants a set of talents. And then the servants are to enlarge those talents, to invest, to improve upon them. The man comes back, sees that 2 of the servants did that, but the one didn't, and then the one is cast out. And I believe the talent he had is given to another. So this parable gives a tremendous insight into the operation of God's kingdom. And in fact, we're given a clue at the very beginning of the parable when the Lord says the kingdom of heaven is as a man, and then as a man has gone away and giving the talents to his servants, to indicate that this parable is showing how heaven operates. And when we are talking about talents, we are talking about money, and a significant amount of money. But what I want us to think about is that talents refer to stewardship. It refers to some portion that the servants are to manage. And as you can see as well, the stewardship varies depending on the servant. And so in God's kingdom, what we start to see, if we apply this, if this is God's kingdom, we see that there are people of different talents and abilities, different degrees of stewardship, who are given their stewardship and are expected to improve and expand upon it. And those who do enter the joy of the Lord, and those who don't are cast out because they are not part of God's kingdom, because God's kingdom is a kingdom of growth and improvement, of flourishing, of expansion, of any description in that realm describing progression. That's what God's kingdom is. So those who expand enter the joy of the Lord. That's also the rest of the Lord. And they're able to enter into the rest of the Lord because they have assurance that they utilize their time wisely and have been productive servants, and they can rest in the presence of the Lord knowing that. And so this idea of replenishing is baked into the meaning of stewardship. And what I mean by that is our purpose of having a stewardship is we are giving some area of control, something to manage, and the Lord expects us to improve upon that, just as he does with anything he's been given, and 10 times over or a million times over, right? We are just operating on a microcosm. The Lord is operating on a grand scale. But nevertheless, we act like he would in our place by managing our stewardship and expanding upon that. And that's the idea of multiply and replenish the earth, which we learned from Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are the first example. When God created the earth and he put man and woman on it, the first thing he told them to do was to tend the garden and to take care of it. That was their stewardship. And he does command them to multiply and replenish the earth, and we often think that's associated with having kids, and that could be a part, but it's something broader, which is you are to improve, you are to replicate the good, you are to continually to expand the earth, to make it better than it was before I put you there. And by doing that, Adam and Eve, and particularly Adam as the priest, was to ensure that no evil entered the garden and that the garden could be preserved. But yet he fell, is because Satan came in and tempted, and they did not at that time honor their stewardship. And so what happens when you don't honor your stewardship is you lose it, because you showed that you weren't qualified to manage it, and the Lord then gives you a lower level to then hopefully bring you back up. And so that's what happened with Adam and Eve. And so one helpful way to think of God's kingdom, to see how this fits in a bigger picture, is to think of God's kingdom as a pyramid. And this pyramid is to represent a hierarchy. And as you can see with any pyramid, it gets narrower at the top. And so there are less and less people. If you could fit people along here, you could fit more people on the base than you can at the top, right? Further, to get up to the top is a higher climb, and God sits at the top. And this is his kingdom. And it's this major triangle, or you could also refer to as a mountain. The idea of mountain of the Lord comes up in Psalms. And this is what it's referring to is this hierarchical organization society. There is a mountain, Mount Sinai, but when it's referring to a mountain of the Lord in the scriptures, it's also referring to this broader idea of a hierarchical society in heaven. And how the society is organized is through stewardships. And each servant has a task, and they also oversee, based on their level, other people, and not necessarily the way I've depicted where one person's over two people. And this is just to illustrate that the higher up you go, the more responsibility you have, the more people you oversee. We know from the scriptures that there are different degrees of angels, and we know that there are archangels, and then there's cherubim and seraphim, or seraphim, cherubim. I don't know which comes in between those, but those are degrees of angels, and those angels have responsibilities and they oversee. And so we often think when we are praying to God that we are praying just directly to him. And what's actually happening is that there are intermediaries who are passing on our petition and prayer up to God based on the degree of merit that prayer contains and the worthiness for God to hear it. Because there's so many people praying, and the angels sort and decide which ascends up to God's ears. And that's why in the scripture says, the prayers entered into my ears. That's a significant phrase, because it means this prayer is found worthy to pass the sentinels, the angelic sentinels, and enter into my presence in my ears, and I've heard it. And so that's one component, but other things as well is that they're managing other aspects of God's kingdom. One thing to learn as well is that the events we receive here, what we experience in the temporal realm, is being influenced by the spiritual, and that influence is for good and evil. And when it comes for good, it is God's servants operating their stewardship and the angels that are under their control to bring about those purposes. And so God is a delegator, and he delegates his work to angels, to certain angels, and that gets delegated down, just like a company ladder, right? And you have different angels with different responsibilities, and they oversee different things. And so there's this whole system organized here, and that is based on their stewardship. That like, you could say that what they are in charge of, each angel, is their stewardship. And the idea is that they are to show they are worthy by improving upon what they have, and then they can ascend. So when it comes to us, each of us has a stewardship. And this can be multiple stewardships, not just one. For those who have families, your family is certainly a stewardship, and God expects you to improve and better that. Your career is a stewardship. Your placement within your social circle, your social life, social relationships is a stewardship. Wealth is a stewardship. As you can see, anything that we are given some area to manage is part of our stewardship in the broader sense, not in the law of consecration sense, but in a broader sense. And what God does is he expects us to improve it. And if he improves it, God will give us more. And one example of this is Abraham, who was very wealthy. He was visited by 3 angels. And one of the things that he did is he showed the angels, when they came, he fed them to demonstrate to the angels that he was worthy of more light and truth, because he honored the current stewardship he had. He basically said, this is what God has given me, and this is how I've improved it. And he essentially telling the angels by saying that, like, let God know that have honored everything, and I'm ready for further light and truth. And Proverbs reflects this idea. It says, seest thou a man diligent in his business? And we can translate it as work, and that's a more accurate term, as other translators have also said it. So it's not business as in just like a singular business enterprise, but your work more broadly, any activity you're engaged in. So it says, seest thou a man diligent in his work? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean men. And so what this is saying is that the man who is diligent or skillful in his work will stand before kings. And to stand before kings means to serve or minister to another. And that comes from Genesis 41 with Joseph, and also with King David and Saul. That term is used for service. So when Joseph is serving not Potiphar, the king, I don't know if we know his name, the Pharaoh, we don't know his name though, but the Pharaoh of Egypt, it says stand before the Pharaoh, indicating that he is serving the Pharaoh. And so the idea then is that we improve, God wants us to improve our stewardship. And as we do, we become exalted to a level of higher standing. So there's that one thing where there are kings versus mean men, so we're separated, but also we then use that position to then serve others. And that's ultimately what's going on in God's kingdom. And I'm going to go back, is that the ascension upwards, when you ascend upwards, you are giving greater stewardship. But when the stewardship you're given is greater service to others. And so the higher up you are, the more service you are giving to others. And this is what righteous people do, is that they serve by giving of their lives to benefit others. And that's really the core distinction or feature of the righteous, is that they give of themselves for the benefit of others. Where the wicked, and I've said this before, but the wicked take from others for their own benefit, right? So one takes, one gives. And so as you become and increase your stewardship, the role is that you then are to serve. And this is how God's kingdom works, by extension, Zion. Zion will become Zion when the people rise up and honor their stewardship. And that's what the Lord was doing with the saints in Doctrine and Covenants, is he was preparing them for Zion by giving them a sample of what Zion would be like on a mini level, which was manage your land, show that you can improve upon that. And then to some others, he said, okay, now we're going to do a mercantile firm, manage that, and then I'll give you more. And that's how Zion will work, is that each person will have a stewardship, and then they will improve upon that. And by doing so, improve and better Zion. And so there is not equality in the sense of everyone being equal. There's no egalitarian society. That's a myth. There is always going to be a hierarchy, as we learned from Abraham, that whenever there are two spirits, one is always higher than the other, and that it goes upward. So there's always going to be someone better than us and always someone that we're better than. And that's how it works. And what God does with that is he gives us the task of expanding our stewardship, so then that whatever position we're in, we improve that sphere of our life and then better. And so, and then also better the world. So here we have is this idea again, the higher up is greater responsibility, and then the lower is less responsibility, and that's based on our stewardship. And so it's worth considering, how can you expect to rule over worlds if you cannot rule over your own body? And by body, I mean appetites, overeating, perhaps, being overweight, obese, emotions, lust. Those are all signs that we are not managing our body. And if we can't manage our body, then how can we rule over worlds or sections of worlds, or even um, a battalion of angels or so forth, right? The idea is, how can you expect to be given more responsibility if you can't even handle your own body? And that's why when people say, oh, God, we just have to believe and that's it, it's ridiculous, because God, that limits what the power of God, and you don't trust his word fully when he says that you can overcome the world. And so if you want to be like him, you have to first overcome the body and its desires, or its carnal desires, and replace those with the spiritual. But and again, even with the room, how you can't keep your room clean, how can you manage more than that? And that's something that I'm working on. Not my room necessarily, but more than that. I'm not very clean. Kind of get absent-minded sometimes, and when I'm with work and other things, and so I'm working on that. And the Lord's kind of pointed that out as an area of improvement as I've gone to him and asked. And so that's something that I'm really focusing on. Again, how can you manage legions of angels if you can barely keep your household from falling apart? And why would the angels respect you if you can't even properly discipline your kids or help your kids to be raised correctly? Not saying that by doing that you'll necessarily prevent them from apostatizing, but if you do everything you can and you create a system of order, then you show to God that you can be given more responsibility. How can you work in the bigger scheme of salvation of others if you're overcome by temporal things? And then how can you intercede for others if you can't even show love for your neighbor? And I don't even mean neighbor next door, I just mean neighbor broadly, like Christ used. Anyone in your realm, if you have bitterness towards them, then how are you going to be given greater responsibility, as we talked, which is greater service, greater position in your seed, if you hold hatred in your heart? And so ultimately what this gets at is, each area of our life is an area to improve. It's an area that we have been given control over. And it's what God is testing to see if we'll be able to handle more. And there's a quote by Aristotle. It says, men become builders by building houses, and harpists by playing the harp. Similarly, we grow just by the practice of just actions, self-control by exercising our self-control, and courageous by performing acts of courage. So what Aristotle is simply saying, and it's true, is we become what we do. So if we want to become a builder, we have to build a house. If we want to have self-control, we need to exercise self-control. And so, put another way, if we want to become gods, then we have to do what gods do. And this ultimately ties back into the idea of agency. Greater responsibility means greater agency. And I refer you to D&C 29 for further information. But what we have then in part of managing our stewardship, in order to exercise this greater agency, we come on this earth, we are seeking to increase our awareness. We then use correct discernment. With that correct discernment, we are able to promote the good better than we used to. We improve our stewardship. And then God gives us more awareness, and we rinse and repeat. And so for each and every aspect we are in, our idea is to increase our awareness of that situation so we more fully understand it. We discern the correct action, and by doing so, we promote the good, and we promote flourishing within that sphere of control. And then our stewardship has improved, and we might still stay with the same stewardship, but we increase that until God finds that we are ready for more, and he will do so in his own time, and he'll increase our stewardship. But I want to also be clear that low earthly rank does not necessarily mean low heavenly rank, right? Jesus was a craftsman, an itinerant preacher, and was homeless and went hungry, but yet he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so don't get caught up on necessarily your temporal rank. It's more about what you are able to do and what what you have control over and how you're managing that in promoting the good. Another thing too to keep in mind is that often be exalted in heaven requires abasement in earthly status. So this can be voluntary, where Alma chose to leave judgment seat to just be a preacher, or it can be involuntarily, such as Paul, Job, or Abraham. Right? Abraham was basically had to flee his father's house, Egypt, because they tried to kill him, and he really had no choice. And Paul as well. I mean, he still could reject the Lord, but it was pretty clear at that time. And so he had to leave being a Pharisee and the status that went along with that. Another thing is wealth is not necessarily a sign either. It could be wealth, and if you have wealth, that could be a way to improve in your stewardship. But just because you're not wealthy doesn't mean that you have a low stewardship. Because again, I point to Jesus and others. But the idea then still is to improve whatever God's given you, to show that if he did give you more, you'd be able to do it regardless of the circumstances.